of law. Now, what about the logical structure of CSR? Well, CSR purports to create social obligations which apply to companies in certain contexts when they perform certain actions in certain locations. The idea is that companies are expected to meet what could be called ethical obligations, but which are ultimately social obligations that aren't necessarily based on their own self-interest, but instead are based upon the interests of their stakeholders and or even moral or ethical principles that society, as a collection of human beings and communities, have determined that all actors must meet. So CSR2 then, like law, is a conditional constraint that arises when certain actions take place. Second of all, CSR, I believe, will be increasingly used to evaluate the behavior of companies. How could this be done? It could be done in a marketplace. And it is already being done in a marketplace. Investors may decide not to invest in a company. They may decide to withdraw their funds from a company based upon their evaluation of whether or not the company has met the reasonable constraints of CSR as a social obligation. Now, you might say, well, that's just a marketplace and those decisions are just being made based upon self-interest. There's no real logic to it. But I don't think that that is empirically the case, because these decisions aren't being made in the absence of reasons. These decisions are being made after the actions of these companies have been evaluated. So they're distinct from a purely monetary, financial gains type of analysis. In this respect, I think that we are beginning to see CSR being used as a evaluative condition to determine whether or not corporate actors are acting in an acceptable way, in the same way that law is used to evaluate social actors. The third part, conditional imperatives, consequences. Does CSR create consequences? Well, the withdrawal of funds from companies could be considered a consequence. There's also a growing consensus amongst theorists of CSR that there could be what's called a loss of a social license to operate, where basically if companies act too contrary to these social expectations, they may be put out of business. We've seen that happen, with Enron and with other companies that have simply conducted themselves in a manner which was so socially unacceptable. They didn't necessarily violate legislated laws or regulations per se, but they were sufficiently in violation of social expectations that the consequence was that they could no longer even do business. So these are real consequences. Another consequence might be the fact of new legislation. New legislation could arise that would deal with areas that companies have failed to deal with adequately themselves. So I think there's a whole host of consequences that can arise from evaluations of behavior in relation to the constraints of CSR. So in this way, I see law and CSR as being fundamentally, logically the same. Now, clearly they will come from different sources. They may be implied in different ways, but I think there's a role for lawyers to play in understanding these concepts and also in incorporating these ideas into the practice of law, because it tells you not only what existing social obligations are for our clients, but it also may tell us the direction that hard law or legislation and regulations and policy might go. It could be a harbinger for new developments in the hard law, as they'd say. Now, these are the kinds of topics that I'm going to talk about in my blog, but I also want to keep my blog practical. And so I'm going to have book reviews, I'm going to look at case law in Canada and abroad, and I'm going to look at some new developments that are arising in the field of an area of social reporting, sustainability reporting, or non-financial reporting, whatever you want to call it. I'm actually currently working on a project in association with the Hennick Center for Law and Business at Osgoode Hall Law School, which this organization is conducting a consultation and preparing a final report that I'm working on with the Hennick Center that will inform the Government of Ontario about how to enhance disclosure of what's called corporate social performance information, which would include things like human rights practices, labor practices, employment, health and safety, equitable pay, all of these things, to disclose them in what are essentially financial statements. This is a consultation that's being conducted in association with the Ontario Securities Commission. So that's where I'm going to be going with this blog. If you want to read a hard copy or articles that I'm preparing, again, my blog's web address is lexsustineo.blogspot.com. I have a link on the YouTube channel, and I hope to see you again soon. Thank you.